The sound of the gavel struck like thunder in that hushed London courtroom in the year 1963, its echo rolling into history as though it had been waiting for centuries. At the center of the scene was a young woman, Christine Keeler, her eyes lifted and her expression still, not so much defiant as tired. She was only 19 when the eyes of a nation, and indeed of the world, first turned toward her. But by the time the gavel fell, she seemed older than her years, hollowed by scrutiny, bearing a burden too heavy for slender shoulders. She was accused of perjury, accused of betrayal, accused of rocking the foundations of government and morality. Yet what was she truly guilty of? Was it desire or ambition, or simply the act of being seen in the wrong places at the wrong time? That question has lingered like smoke long after the scandal ended, drifting across the decades, unanswered, unanswerable. Welcome, dear listener. You and I share this moment in time, though we are separated by distance, by circumstance, perhaps even by generations. Tell me, where are you listening from, and at what hour of the night or day do these words find you? If you would, leave your memory among others, so that together we may weave a tapestry of times and places, a global memory network stretching across oceans and centuries. And if you wish this tale to continue, support this gathering of stories by pressing subscribe, that we may not lose one another in the endless corridors of time. The fog lay low upon the streets of Middlesex in the winter of 1942 when Christine Keeler was born. The war had not yet run its course, and though the bombs no longer fell daily on London, the chill of rationing, the fear of air raids, and the shadow of death were still near. Imagine, if you can, the gray rows of houses, paint peeling, bricks stained with smoke, windows dimmed by blackout curtains that had become habit. In such places, children learned early that the world was not gentle. Christine was one of them. Her father was absent, her mother struggled to hold the fragile household together, and poverty clung to the family like damp on a wall. For Christine, the world outside the narrow street was already an unreachable horizon. Yet even then, her presence had a lightness to it, a flame that caught the attention of others, though she was too young to understand what that meant. She would carry that same light all her life, and it would both raise her up and betray her. When we think of childhood, do we not imagine a sanctuary, a place where innocence is guarded until it can be given up freely? For Christine, there was no such sanctuary. There were dark corners, whispered quarrels, and the heavy sense of being unwanted. She spent her earliest years in a caravan, cramped, cold, the sound of rain drumming on thin metal above her. Sometimes she was cared for, sometimes neglected, sometimes simply overlooked. It is said that she bore the marks of abuse before she even knew what such words meant. Whether one believes these accounts or not, they form part of her story, and in them lies the root of her longing to escape. The world around her was narrow, gray, and cruel. She dreamed of brightness, of silken dresses, of stages and cameras, of being seen, if only to prove she existed. Children in wartime England grew quickly. Christine's schooling was brief and unremarkable, the lessons lost in the press of survival. She did not shine as a student, but she shone in ways that could not be captured in a book or written on a page. She was slender, with eyes that seemed too large for her face, and hair that fell carelessly, hinting at beauty not yet formed. Even before she reached her teens, strangers looked at her longer than they should. She learned that her presence could silence a room, but she did not yet understand what a dangerous power this was. What does it mean to be seen before one can choose how to be seen? Is it a gift or a curse laid quietly at a child's feet? The war ended, yet peace was not the gentle bloom that many had imagined. England was tired, its empire in retreat, its cities scarred by bombs. The promise of renewal was slow in coming, and for the poor, like Christine's family, there was little change. Hunger remained, damp walls remained, and the sense of being left behind remained. Christine grew taller, thinner, and hungrier still, not only for food, but for life itself. The sounds of post-war Britain were not the songs of triumph, but the clatter of factories, the whistle of trains, the scrape of shovels on building sites. In that landscape, dreams of silk and champagne were as distant as the moon, and yet, in the quiet spaces of her mind, Christine nurtured those dreams. She began to notice photographs in magazines, the images of models draped across cars, perched on stools in smoky clubs, smiling into flashbulbs. She saw women who had escaped their narrow beginnings by being looked at, women who had turned beauty into a form of survival. Was this not a path she, too, could follow? To be admired instead of forgotten, to be adorned instead of abandoned? The seed was planted, though she did not yet know how it would grow or what bitter fruit it might bear. By the time Christine was 14, she had left school, her education finished, though her life had scarcely begun. She worked in a bakery, in a hairdressing salon, in the small, weary places where girls of her background were expected to spend their days. She earned little, saved little, and saw little future. Yet she carried herself with a curious grace, and others noticed. Some admired, some coveted, some sought to use. Each gaze left an invisible mark, and Christine, though she wished to escape poverty, could not escape this. In time, she began to feel that the only way forward was to step fully into the light of those gazes, to wield them before they wielded her. But life in those early years was not only struggle. There were small joys, walking by the river on rare, warm afternoons, hearing music spill from open doorways, feeling the rhythm of jazz and the promise it carried. There were moments when laughter came easily, when dreams seemed possible, when the future did not yet weigh so heavily. She was still young enough to believe in chance, in the possibility that one day a door might open. But beneath those moments lay a steady current of restlessness. It was as though she were waiting for something, or someone, to lift her beyond the narrow streets, beyond the caravan, beyond the bakery and the salon. The fog outside thickened, wrapping the world in a veil of silence. Christine, still little more than a girl, looked from her window and saw the glow of lamps struggling against the gray. She wondered where those lamps might lead, wondered if somewhere beyond them there was a place for her. The air was cold, damp with winter, and the scent of coal lingered. In the distance, footsteps faded, and the curtain of fog settled once more, as though holding its secrets close. The fog did not lift quickly, but through its veil one could hear the faint echo of music, a rhythm rising and falling, not quite near, not quite far. It was the sound of jazz spilling from a doorway in Soho, carried by the night air to the restless girl who would one day step through such doors herself. Christine was in her mid-teens then, a child no longer, though the world treated her with a curious contradiction, as though she were both too young to be trusted and too old to be protected. Her days in the suburbs were marked by tedium, by endless repetition of small tasks that seemed to lead nowhere, while her nights were filled with dreams of light, of movement, of escape. She had begun to imagine London not as a city of fog and toil, but as a stage, a place where one could reinvent oneself simply by entering the right room, by being seen under the right light. For those who came from poverty, the city offered temptations as well as dangers. Soho, in particular, was alive with both. There were clubs lit in neon, their doors guarded by men with knowing eyes. There were smoke-filled rooms where music tangled with laughter, where the air seemed thick with promise. There were girls no older than Christine who danced for coins, and others who disappeared into the shadows, never to be spoken of again. To step into this world was to risk losing oneself, but it was also to find a kind of freedom denied in the narrow streets of Middlesex. Christine, restless and sharp with longing, began to walk the edges of this world, first as a spectator, then as a participant. At first, her work remained ordinary. She tried her hand in small shops, stood behind counters, brushed hair in salons. But her beauty, even in its unfinished form, drew attention. She was tall, slender, with features that the camera would later learn to adore. Yet she did not yet know how to wield this, only that it set her apart. Men noticed her, sometimes with kindness, often with intent. Women, too, saw it, some with envy, some with pity, some with the wary understanding of what such attention might bring. Christine herself walked uneasily between pride and unease, aware that her appearance could open doors, but uncertain of what might wait on the other side. It was in these years that she began to frequent dance clubs, those half-hidden sanctuaries where music provided both escape and danger. The war was over, rationing was ending, and England longed to forget its scars. In those clubs, people moved as though they could shake off the weight of the past with every beat. Christine watched, then joined, learning to let the music carry her. She was graceful, not polished, but natural, her movements drawing eyes as surely as her face did. She became part of that world, not yet a star, but a presence, a figure who belonged beneath the lights. In such places, she met people unlike those she had known as a child. There were men who claimed wealth, men who hinted at power, men who offered champagne and whispered promises. Some were kind, others careless, all of them intrigued by the young girl who seemed both innocent and knowing. Christine did not yet see the threads being woven around her, threads that would one day tighten into a net. She only saw the chance to step out of obscurity, to taste the life she had imagined. But Soho was not gentle. Alongside the glamour, there was violence, exploitation, and desperation. Behind the laughter, there were deals struck in whispers, debts paid in silence. Christine moved through this world as though on a knife's edge, sometimes oblivious, sometimes aware, always searching for something just out of reach. She wanted to belong, yet she also wanted to escape. How often do we find ourselves torn in this way, pulled between the desire for recognition and the fear of what recognition demands? Her mother had little control over her by then, perhaps never had. The home in which Christine grew had not been one of warmth, and the bond between them was fragile. Christine drifted further into the city, staying away longer, returning less often. The family could not contain her, and perhaps did not try. She was already seeking a new family in the clubs, in the circle of acquaintances who danced, drank, and dreamed beside her. Among them were models, dancers, men who sketched faces or took photographs, and others who lingered in the shadows watching. Christine was learning, without realizing it, how beauty could be currency, how presence could be traded, how youth could be both shield and weapon. There are stories told of these early nights, of Christine standing at the threshold of a club, uncertain yet drawn inside, her breath catching at the swirl of lights and sound. She wore simple clothes then, nothing like the gowns she would later pose in, yet she carried herself with the unstudied elegance of one who belongs without asking. Her eyes, large and searching, reflected the smoke, the glimmer, the shadows. She was still a girl from a caravan, yet already she was becoming something else. Not all who knew her then spoke kindly. Some saw her as reckless, others as foolish. Some dismissed her as another pretty face, destined to fade. But there were those who sensed the story already forming around her, a story larger than she could contain. She had stepped into a current that would sweep her far from the places she had known. And though she might have thought she was guiding her own course, the waters were stronger than she realized. Christine herself, if asked in those years, might have said only that she wanted to be seen, to be remembered, to live a life beyond poverty. She might not have been able to explain why she walked those streets at night, why she lingered in doorways listening to music, why she allowed herself to be photographed even when it brought her trouble. Perhaps she did not know. Perhaps she did not need to know. Sometimes a life is not guided by reason, but by longing, by the quiet pull of something unnamed. The music played on, slow, insistent, full of yearning. Christine stood by the doorway, half in shadow, half in light, her future waiting just beyond. The fog outside had lifted slightly, though the air still smelled of coal and rain. The rhythm of jazz, the laughter of strangers, the glimmer of neon, these were her companions now. She took a step forward, and the echo of her shoes was swallowed by the sound of a trumpet rising into the night. The trumpet's final note lingered in the air, wavering, dissolving into silence, and when it was gone, there remained only the faint scent of perfume drifting through the smoky night. That perfume, elusive and persistent, seemed to mark the doorway to another world, a world Christine was about to enter. In those restless Soho nights, she met the man who would become both benefactor and destroyer, friend and manipulator, the figure around whom her fate would coil like a serpent. His name was Stephen Ward. Ward was unlike the others who crowded the clubs and bars. He was older, refined, carrying himself with the ease of one who belonged among the powerful, yet mingled with the obscure. He was an osteopath, a society portraitist, a man of many masks. To some, he was charming company, a witty conversationalist, a trusted healer. To others, he was a dangerous opportunist, always lingering at the edges of influence, always gathering the vulnerable and beautiful into his circle. To Christine, when they first met, he was a door opening onto a life that seemed impossibly distant from the caravan and the bakery. Their first encounter is remembered in fragments. Some say it was at a party, others in one of those dance clubs where the music never stopped. What remains certain is the impression he left on her. Elegant, worldly, attentive, with the ability to make her feel seen not only as an ornament, but as someone who mattered. Ward had a gift for this, and Christine, hungry for recognition, responded to it. Soon she was drawn into his orbit, a world of artists, aristocrats, and politicians, a world lit by chandeliers instead of street lamps, filled with whispers instead of shouts. Ward's flat became a gathering place. It was not only a home, but a stage where the powerful and the curious mingled. Christine, young and luminous, was welcome there, dressed in borrowed finery, her laughter mingling with the clink of glasses. There were portraits being sketched, secrets being exchanged, alliances being formed in the half-light of rooms, where curtains were always drawn. For Christine, it was intoxicating. She was no longer the girl standing at the doorway of a club, uncertain and shy. She was inside now, part of the circle, part of the game. Yet, even as she smiled, even as she drank champagne she could never have afforded on her own, she did not realize the price of admission. Ward positioned himself as her protector, her mentor, perhaps even her friend. He gave her a place to stay when she had none, offered her introductions, guided her into rooms where she could be admired, but protection of this kind was rarely free. Ward gathered beautiful young women not only for their company, but for what their presence allowed him to trade: favors, influence, whispers of scandal. Christine, unknowingly, became both pawn and prize, her beauty a currency exchanged in conversations to which she was not privy. Did she sense it then? Did some quiet part of her recognize that she was being used? Or was she still too dazzled by the novelty of being wanted, too eager to believe she was climbing toward the life she desired? The perfume lingered. It clung to curtains, to dresses, to the skin of those who entered and left Ward's rooms. It was the scent of artifice, of masks carefully placed and never removed. Christine breathed it in, unaware that it would follow her long after the laughter had faded. She posed for photographs, sometimes clothed, sometimes not, her body becoming both canvas and commodity. The camera loved her, even as it betrayed her. Those images would one day surface in newspapers, not as art, but as evidence, her beauty twisted into accusation. But in those first moments, she believed the lens adored her, and she basked in the gaze it cast upon her. Ward encouraged her to model, to perform, to step further into the light. He told her she had the looks of a starlet, the presence of someone meant to be noticed. She wanted to believe him. For once, someone seemed to affirm the dream she had carried since childhood, that beauty could lift her from obscurity, that being seen was enough to survive. And so she followed where he led, never questioning why doors opened so easily, never wondering what was expected in return. Among Ward's circle were not only artists and musicians, but men of influence, politicians, diplomats, men whose decisions rippled across nations. Christine, scarcely 20, found herself in their company, her presence both delight and distraction. She danced, she smiled, she listened to stories she could barely follow. She was praised, admired, envied, and occasionally pitied. It was a world that offered her glimpses of power, though never power itself. She could see it, almost touch it, yet it always remained in the hands of others, never her own. Was she aware of this distance? Or did she believe, as many might in her place, that time and beauty would bridge the gap? The nights grew longer, the parties more intoxicating. Christine floated between moments of exhilaration and moments of confusion. She was adored, yet she was also disposable. She belonged, yet she remained on the edge. In Ward's world, contradictions were endless, and she was learning to live with them, to wear them as one wears a borrowed dress. Still, there must have been moments when she wondered who she truly was, whether she was Christine, the girl from Middlesex, Christine the showgirl, Christine the muse, or simply Christine. A face in a crowd too bright to see clearly. The perfume lingered still, clinging to her as she left one evening, stepping out into the night air. It was late, the streets quiet, the city holding its breath. She walked alone, her heels clicking softly against the pavement, the scent trailing her like a memory she could not shake. Somewhere behind her, laughter echoed faintly from Ward's flat, fading as the door closed. Ahead of her, the fog was gathering once more, wrapping the street in a veil of uncertainty. She pulled her coat tighter, inhaling the fragrance that was no longer hers, and wondered, perhaps, what waited beyond the next doorway. The perfume clung still, invisible yet present, as Christine returned again to Ward's flat, where laughter and music spilled through the drawn curtains, and the glow of lamplight softened the corners of the room. It was here that his circle gathered, a curious assembly of the glittering and the powerful, the bohemian and the secretive. Aristocrats brushed shoulders with artists, politicians with dancers, diplomats with girls scarcely out of childhood, their conversations flowing as freely as the wine, their smiles practiced, yet never entirely sincere. To step into that room was to enter a stage play, every glance rehearsed, every gesture layered with meaning. And Christine, still so young, became part of the set, a figure of beauty that caught the eye, though she was rarely permitted to speak lines of her own. Ward presided like a host from some ancient masque, his charm wrapping the gathering in a sense of ease. He moved easily between the circles, bending low to whisper in one ear, pausing to sketch the face of another, his hand steady, his eye attentive. He presented himself as friend, as confidant, as patron, yet beneath it all he was something more elusive, a weaver of threads invisible to those who sat in his rooms. Christine could not yet see the pattern, only the fragments, a lord's laugh, a general's frown, an artist's sigh, her own reflection in a glass of wine. She watched, she listened, she absorbed. The room smelled of tobacco and polish, of roses set in heavy vases, of that same perfume that seemed always to linger, mingling with the scent of brandy and smoke. The sound shifted from the clink of glasses to the low strum of a guitar, from laughter to murmured confidences. One could never tell, in such a space, what was truth and what was performance. Christine, drifting between groups, felt both included and excluded, cherished and used. There were moments when the attention lifted her, made her feel radiant, but also moments when she realized she was not seen as herself, only as a reflection of something others desired. What does it mean to be present yet invisible, to be admired but not known? Perhaps Christine did not yet have the words for this paradox, yet she must have felt it. She was the flame that drew moths, but she did not control the flame. She was the portrait sketched on canvas, but not the hand that held the brush. Ward's gatherings were not merely social. They were nets cast wide, pulling in connections, drawing power into his sphere. The girls he surrounded himself with were ornaments but also keys, unlocking doors that would otherwise have remained closed. Christine was one such key, though she did not realize it. To some men in the room, she was entertainment. To others, temptation. To Ward himself, perhaps she was both. He encouraged her to stay, to dance, to laugh, to pose for yet more sketches, to bask in the glow of admiration. But admiration can be a fragile light, and when it fades, it often leaves behind only shadow. Christine began to learn the art of masks herself. She smiled when she was uncertain, laughed when she was uneasy, feigned understanding when conversations rose beyond her grasp. She became adept at moving gracefully among strangers, at hiding the unease that sometimes gnawed at her. Yet beneath the mask she remained the girl from the caravan, longing not simply to be admired, but to be cared for. Did anyone in those rooms ever see her without the mask? Did anyone glimpse the child still hidden behind her beauty? Among the guests, there were names she would not forget, names that would one day be spoken in courtrooms and headlines. Politicians whose ambitions reached high, diplomats whose loyalties were divided, men of influence whose presence seemed natural in Ward's rooms. They regarded Christine with curiosity, sometimes with desire, sometimes with contempt. To them, she was a fleeting amusement, a spark in an evening otherwise dulled by routine. To Christine, they were figures from another world, unreachable, incomprehensible, yet drawn close by Ward's peculiar alchemy. She stood among them as though in a dream, half aware of the currents swirling around her. The gatherings continued, each blurring into the next, nights of smoke and perfume, of whispered words and lingering glances. Christine became accustomed to it, even dependent on it, the sense of belonging, however fragile. Yet there were moments when she slipped away, standing alone by a window, looking out into the fog beyond. The city outside was silent, distant, indifferent. She wondered which world was real, the narrow, cold streets of her childhood, or these rooms of warmth and deception. Perhaps both were real. Perhaps neither. Perhaps she was adrift between them, unable to claim either as her own. Ward watched her with interest, perhaps even affection, though his motives were never clear. Did he see her as a daughter, a muse, a pawn, or something else entirely? Those who later spoke of him disagreed. Some called him a villain, others a victim, still others a tragic figure caught in the web he himself had spun. Christine, in those days, might have called him a friend, though friendship in such a place was always shadowed by use. The night grew late. The laughter grew softer, the music slower. Guests departed one by one, leaving glasses half empty, ash still smoldering. Christine lingered, as she often did, reluctant to step back into the cold air outside. She moved through the rooms, her fingers brushing the back of a chair, the edge of a curtain, the corner of a sketchbook left open on a table. She felt the weight of eyes still upon her, though the room was nearly empty. It was a gaze she could not escape, a gaze that seemed to define her more than her own reflection ever could. A candle burned low on the mantel, its wax pooling unnoticed, dripping slowly onto the polished wood below. Christine watched the flame flicker, its light unsteady, its end inevitable. She thought perhaps of her own brightness, of how easily it could be extinguished once the air grew still. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, silent, patient, waiting. The candle's flame trembled, its wax dripping onto the polished mantelpiece, and as Christine's eyes followed the molten trail, her own path was already curving toward another destiny. The gatherings at Ward's flat, with their laughter and their secrets, with their masks and their shadows, were only preludes to the greater stage awaiting her. For beyond those rooms of smoke and perfume lay the estates of the powerful, the manicured gardens where decisions of state were whispered as though they were trifles, and where, in one summer evening, her life would tilt forever. It was at Cliveden, the grand country house of Lord Astor, that Christine Keeler first set eyes upon John Profumo, and with that meeting the threads of scandal, betrayal, and tragedy began to weave themselves tightly around her. The day was warm, the kind of English summer day that seems rare enough to be treasured. The lawn stretched green and immaculate, the river shone with shifting light, and guests drifted among the gardens with glasses of wine in hand, their laughter mingling with the hum of insects in the air. Christine was there at Ward's invitation, little more than 19, dressed simply yet with a natural elegance that made her appear both part of and apart from the glittering company. She stood at the edge of the pool, her figure reflected in the rippling water, when the cabinet minister noticed her. John Profumo was older by decades, a man of position, a husband, a father, a Secretary of State for War in Harold Macmillan's government. He carried the authority of one who had long moved in the highest circles, yet he was also known for charm, for a certain warmth that could disarm even as it entangled. When his eyes met Christine's across the garden, the air itself seemed to pause. Was it fate, accident, or simply the ordinary collision of desire and opportunity? Those who later wrote of it would disagree, but for Christine, standing in the sunlight, it was only a moment, a gaze that held hers longer than it should have. Introductions were made. Ward, always the orchestrator, was quick to place Christine within Profumo's path, as though he had anticipated the spark that might fly between them. Conversation began with pleasantries, the weather, the beauty of the gardens, the easy subjects that mask intent. But beneath the words ran another current, silent yet undeniable. Profumo was captivated, Christine intrigued. To her, he represented a world even more distant than Ward's gatherings, a world of parliament, of decisions shaping nations, of men whose words were carried in headlines and whose lives seemed untouchable. To him, she was youth, beauty, vitality, a reminder of pleasures beyond duty. The sun drifted lower, the shadows stretched across the lawn, yet still their eyes returned to one another. There is something about gardens that invites secrets, the way hedges conceal, the way paths meander, the way water reflects without revealing. Christine, scarcely out of childhood, walked those paths with a man whose decisions carried the weight of armies. Did she feel the imbalance, the gulf between them? Or did she only feel the thrill of being chosen, singled out, lifted for a moment above the anonymity of the crowd? Later, as the guests gathered once more, laughter and glasses raised, the meeting seemed to fade into the hum of conversation. Yet Christine carried it with her, the warmth of his gaze, the softness of his voice. It was as though a door had opened, not yet crossed, but waiting, inviting. She could not know then how swiftly she would step through, nor how irrevocable the step would be. Profumo, too, carried the moment with him, Perhaps he tried to dismiss it, to remind himself of his wife, his office, his responsibilities. But the memory lingered, fragrant as the roses in Cliveden's garden, persistent as the summer air. He would see her again, and soon, and in doing so, he would set into motion the unraveling of his career, his government, his reputation. But in that moment, in the fading light of the garden, none of this was visible. Only the shimmer of water disturbed by a falling leaf, only the soft laughter of guests drifting into the night. Christine left Cliveden with a sense of something begun. The perfume of the evening clung to her, the image of the garden imprinted in her mind. She had been noticed, truly noticed, by a man whose name meant something beyond the narrow circles she had known. For a girl who had grown up unseen, overlooked, dismissed, the recognition was intoxicating. Yet recognition is not always kindness, and admiration is not always care. She could not yet know how easily admiration could turn to accusation, how swiftly recognition could dissolve into betrayal. The evening grew darker. The gardens emptied, the river shimmered under a thin veil of moonlight. Christine walked slowly, her footsteps soft upon the path, her heart unsettled yet strangely alight. Somewhere behind her, voices lingered, promises unspoken. Somewhere ahead of her, a story was waiting, a story too heavy for her to carry, yet one she would bear nonetheless. The shimmer of the pool caught her eye once more, its surface broken by the faintest ripple, and she thought of how easily calm could be disturbed, how quickly stillness could become turbulence. The leaf upon the water drifted in circles, carried by currents unseen. Christine watched it for a moment longer, then turned away, not knowing she too was drifting, carried by currents stronger than she could resist. The night closed around her, soft, scented, uncertain. The garden lay silent, the leaf still turning, the ripple spreading outward into the darkness. The ripple on the pool spread outward, slow and insistent, until it seemed to vanish into the stillness of the night. Yet its pattern lingered unseen beneath the surface. So too did the memory of Cliveden linger with Christine, a quiet current that pulled her into deeper waters. In the weeks that followed, paths were crossed again, not by accident but by design. A note, a telephone call, an invitation whispered with the care of secrecy, and soon Christine was drawn into meetings with John Profumo away from the gardens, away from the watchful eyes of others. What began as a glance in sunlight became a shadowed affair, private yet perilously fragile. The first encounters carried the breathless quality of discovery. Christine, still barely 19, felt herself chosen, lifted into a space where few of her age and station could imagine belonging. Profumo was older, polished, with a manner that suggested both power and gentleness. He spoke to her as though she mattered, as though her youth and beauty gave her a place beside him, if only in secret. She responded with curiosity, with eagerness, with a hunger born not only of desire but of years of being unseen. In his presence, she was noticed, spoken to, cherished. At least for a time, they met in hidden places, their conversations wrapped in whispers, their laughter softened by closed curtains. The world beyond their rooms seemed to fall away, yet in truth it grew ever closer, pressing against the walls with the weight of risk. For Christine, there was excitement in the secrecy, a thrill in walking streets knowing a man of such stature waited for her. For Profumo, there was both temptation and danger, the forbidden sweetness of youth that his position demanded he resist, yet his heart insisted he pursue. Together, they created a fragile sanctuary, built on desire and denial, destined to collapse. Christine spoke later of those days as fleeting, moments more imagined than real. There were dinners, gifts, soft words spoken in the quiet. Yet there was also distance, a sense that she was cherished only in private, hidden, never truly acknowledged. The imbalance of power was clear, though she did not always name it. He was a minister of state, a man with responsibilities that stretched across continents. She was a girl from the caravan, barely beginning her life, her future still uncertain. And yet, in the small private rooms they shared, those differences dissolved into intimacy, into a closeness that felt, for a while, like love. But even in the midst of this closeness, there was an unease, a sense of inevitability. The secrecy itself was a burden, a weight carried in every glance, every movement. Christine was watched, not only by Ward but by others who moved in the shadows, who saw in her not a girl in love, but a figure in a larger game. She may have thought herself free, guided only by her own choices, yet each step was already marked by the eyes of those who waited for the moment to strike. The whispers grew louder. In the clubs of Soho, in the drawing rooms of Ward's circle, Christine's presence was noted, her absence remarked upon. Stories began to drift, fragments pieced together by those who made it their trade to know the secrets of others. She was both admired and envied, both pitied and resented. Some saw her as reckless, others as fortunate, still others as dangerous. She was becoming, without realizing it, a symbol, her name spoken in tones of curiosity and suspicion long before the newspapers ever carried it. For Christine herself, the affair was not simple. There were moments of affection, but also moments of doubt, of loneliness, of feeling used and discarded. Profumo's attention was not constant. He came and went, his duties pulling him elsewhere, his affections divided by a wife, by a family, by a public life that could not include her. Christine waited, sometimes patiently, sometimes bitterly, wondering if she was cherished or merely indulged. The thrill of being chosen gave way at times to the ache of being hidden, the pain of being reduced to secrecy. Was it love, or was it only desire? Did he see her as she was, or only as a fleeting distraction? These questions lingered, unanswered in the silence between his visits, and yet she returned, again and again, drawn by the warmth of his presence, by the intoxicating sense of being desired by someone so far above her station. It is easy, looking back, to judge, to ask why she stayed, why she risked so much. But how many of us, offered escape from obscurity, offered affection after years of neglect, would turn away? Christine was young, and youth does not always see the danger in what feels like happiness. She believed, perhaps, in the possibility of being more than she was, of being carried into a world she had only glimpsed through newspapers and whispers. The meetings continued, their secrecy both thrilling and suffocating. Outside their hidden rooms, the world carried on, indifferent yet waiting. The newspapers printed headlines of politics and war, of crises abroad, while beneath the surface a different story was being written, one that would soon eclipse them all. Christine, unaware of the scale of what she was part of, moved between nights of laughter and mornings of silence, her heart caught between hope and fear. There were moments when she sensed the fragility of it, moments when Profumo's gaze grew distant, when his words were cautious, when his attention faltered. She must have known, deep down, that such a bond could not last, that the world outside their rooms would not allow it. Yet she held on, as one clings to warmth in the cold, as one holds a candle in the wind, knowing it will burn out, yet unwilling to let it go. The affair, though brief in time, stretched long in memory, its echoes lasting far beyond its days. For Christine, it was a chapter of intimacy and illusion, of being desired yet never truly known. For Profumo, it was a mistake that would haunt him, a secret that could not be contained. For England, it would become a scandal that shook the foundations of government. But in those moments, when curtains were drawn and whispers filled the room, it was only a man and a woman, caught in desire, blind to the storm gathering outside. The door closed softly behind them one evening, its click sharp in the silence, a sound that seemed ordinary yet carried with it the weight of destiny. The locked door marked the boundary between secrecy and revelation, between intimacy and exposure. Beyond it, footsteps echoed faintly in the hall, the world moving closer, waiting for the moment when the door would be forced open and the truth laid bare. The echo of retreating footsteps down the quiet hall seemed to linger long after they had faded, as though the sound itself carried a warning that neither Christine nor Profumo fully wished to hear. Behind the locked doors, their affair unfolded in whispers and shadows. Yet beyond those doors, the world pressed closer, the threads of secrecy tightening, straining, threatening to snap. Christine, once exhilarated by the thrill of secrecy, began to feel its weight more heavily, as though every glance cast upon her might conceal suspicion. Every silence might mask a question unspoken. Profumo, too, grew cautious, his smiles sometimes faltering, his visits more hurried, his words edged with the nervous awareness of discovery. What had begun as an intoxicating intimacy now bore the unmistakable taste of fear. Christine noticed the way he checked the time, the way he listened for sounds outside the door, the way his eyes darted when she spoke too freely. He was a man accustomed to control, to managing appearances with the ease of a statesman, but here, in the quiet of their meetings, the cracks were visible. He had a wife, a family, a position that depended on respectability, and Christine was beginning to realize that for him, she was both treasure and threat. She wondered perhaps whether affection could survive such tension, whether desire could thrive under the constant shadow of exposure. She was not blind to the imbalance between them. Profumo could step back into the grand halls of Parliament, into the warmth of his home, into the embrace of legitimacy. Christine, once left behind, returned to rented rooms, to smoky clubs, to the precarious world of showgirls and whispers. For him, the affair was an indulgence to be hidden. For her, it was a tether binding her to a life she half desired, half feared. Did she love him? Perhaps in the way youth loves what it does not fully understand. Did he love her? Perhaps in the way power loves beauty, fleetingly, selfishly, without reckoning the cost. Around them, the city was alive with its own stories, indifferent yet somehow aware. In Ward's flat, the gatherings continued, the perfume still clinging to curtains, the laughter still masking deeper currents. But Christine noticed a shift. Conversations paused when she entered. Glances lingered longer. Whispers grew sharper. Her presence carried a weight it had not before. Ward himself seemed to watch her with keener eyes, as though he knew more than she wished to reveal. He had always been the orchestrator, the arranger of connections, and Christine began to sense that she was not simply his guest, but his piece in a larger game. Profumo grew more distant. His words were softer now, sometimes tinged with warning. He reminded her of the need for silence, of the danger of carelessness. What had once been intimacy now often felt like instruction. Christine, young and defiant, bristled under such caution. She did not fully grasp the scale of the danger, yet she felt the sting of being reduced to secrecy, of being treated as though she were a threat rather than a partner. The warmth between them cooled, replaced by unease. She continued to meet him, yet with each meeting the thrill diminished, the shadows lengthened. At times she must have wondered whether the affair was worth the burden it carried. The gifts, the attention, the intoxicating closeness of power, these were balanced by suspicion, by whispers, by the gnawing sense that she was expendable. She had stepped into a world larger than herself, and though it had welcomed her for a time, it could just as easily cast her out. and still she lingered, as one lingers on the edge of a precipice, knowing the fall is certain, yet unable to step back. The footsteps of others grew louder now, not only Ward's circle, but strangers whose eyes seemed to follow, whose interest seemed too sharp, too persistent. There were men who asked questions with casual tones, women who hinted at knowledge beyond their words. Christine, though untrained in the art of secrecy, felt the scrutiny pressing closer. Her face was becoming known in places she had not walked, her name whispered in rooms she had never entered. The affair that had once seemed private was now a story waiting to be told, a flame hidden beneath paper, smoldering, ready to burst into fire. Profumo, sensing the danger more keenly, began to retreat. His visits grew fewer, his words more careful, his presence more fleeting. He spoke less of affection, more of necessity. Christine was urged to silence, to discretion, to patience. But patience was not a gift she possessed. She had never been taught to wait, only to grasp what appeared before her. To be told to hide, to diminish herself for the sake of his reputation, was a wound as sharp as any betrayal. She began to feel not cherished, but used. And with that realization came a bitterness that deepened the shadows between them. The affair, brief in time, already carried the seeds of its end. Christine, restless and vulnerable, found herself pulled toward other companions, other connections, as though seeking in them what Profumo withheld. The city was full of men willing to admire her, eager to possess her, careless of the risks. Ward's introductions had placed her within reach of figures whose names carried weight far beyond England, men whose interest was as dangerous as it was alluring. And so Christine drifted, caught between loyalties, between desires, between the safety she longed for and the danger she seemed drawn to. The echoes of retreating footsteps became, in time, the sound of departure, more permanent. Profumo began to distance himself more decisively, not with a dramatic end, but with the slow cooling of silence. Christine was left with questions unspoken, with the hollow ache of abandonment, with the awareness that she had been drawn into a story larger than herself and then left standing alone in its center. The strings that bound her to him did not break all at once, but frayed, strand by strand, until only fear and resentment remained. Yet even as he pulled away, the world pressed closer. The whispers were louder now, the scrutiny more intense. Christine was no longer simply a girl from Middlesex, no longer only a showgirl drifting through Soho nights. She was becoming a figure upon whom stories were projected, a name that carried weight, a symbol of something dangerous, something forbidden. She felt the tension in every step, in every glance, as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for revelation. And in the quiet of her rooms, when laughter and perfume were gone, Christine must have listened to the silence and wondered whether the footsteps outside her door were retreating or advancing. Was she being left behind, or was she being pursued? In such uncertainty, fear and desire mingled until they were indistinguishable, and the air itself seemed charged with inevitability. The night grew still. Somewhere a door closed, the sound sharp in the quiet, and Christine felt the pull of currents she could neither resist nor control. The footsteps had faded, but their echo remained, a constant reminder that secrecy was not silence, that retreat was not escape. She turned toward the window, listening, and in the distance there was only the faintest rustle, as though papers were being slipped into a drawer, hidden away, waiting for the moment they would be uncovered. The faint rustle of papers sliding into a drawer lingered in her mind, a sound small in itself yet weighted with secrets. For Christine, those secrets were not fully visible, yet she sensed their presence around her like smoke clinging to fabric. She had already been drawn into a dangerous intimacy with a minister of the crown, and though that bond was fraying, another connection was waiting to ensnare her, colder, more perilous, marked not by desire alone but by the dark currents of politics and espionage. For within Stephen Ward's ever-expanding circle, there appeared Yevgeny Ivanov, a naval attaché from the Soviet embassy, whose accent and bearing carried with them both fascination and dread. Ivanov was no ordinary guest. Tall, reserved, with the practiced ease of a diplomat, he carried with him the weight of another empire, another allegiance. To some in Ward's gatherings, he was simply an exotic presence, a curiosity in a Cold War world where Russians were viewed both with suspicion and with intrigue. To others, his attendance was more troubling, a reminder that Ward's parties were not only games of art and society, but crossroads where worlds collided in silence. Christine first encountered him in one such gathering, a glass in her hand, the scent of perfume still clinging to the curtains. His gaze was steady, his smile measured, and though he spoke warmly, there was a chill beneath his words. Ward, ever the orchestrator, encouraged their acquaintance. He seemed fascinated by the possibilities of such connections, careless of the dangers they carried. To him, the presence of Ivanov alongside Christine was a game of influence, a way to draw together figures from opposing sides as though their mingling were harmless. But beneath the surface, nothing was harmless. Christine, already entangled with Profumo, now found herself conversing with a man whose loyalties lay across the Iron Curtain. Did she recognize the peril? Or did she see only another admirer, another man who noticed her, who spoke to her with attention she had long craved? Their meetings were not many, not intimate in the way her moments with Profumo had been. Yet the mere fact of their existence was enough to darken the air around her. In a world trembling under the weight of nuclear fear, where governments watched every movement of their rivals, the suggestion that a young woman could move between the arms of a British minister and the company of a Soviet official was dynamite, waiting to ignite. Christine, in her youth, may have thought little of it, but others thought much, and their whispers sharpened into accusations. The city itself seemed colder in those days, its fog carrying not only damp, but unease. The Cold War was not fought in open battle on England's streets, yet its chill was felt in glances, in silences, in the careful phrasing of conversations. Christine, drifting through Soho clubs, through Ward's rooms, through apartments dimly lit and smoke-filled, became unknowingly a figure at the center of these tensions. She had no ambition to be a spy, no plan to trade secrets, yet her very presence between these men turned her life into something larger than she could control. Perhaps she sensed it, if only faintly. Ivanov's eyes lingered differently than Profumo's, not with the warmth of desire but with the calculation of interest. He asked questions that seemed casual yet carried weight. And though Christine may have answered carelessly, those answers were not always lost. Did she tell him of Profumo? Did she mention details that seemed trivial to her, but were precious to those who listened in Moscow? Or did she remain silent, her presence alone enough to suggest what words might have confirmed? The truth lies blurred, obscured by memory and rumor, yet the suspicion alone was enough to stain her name. The newspapers had not yet seized upon the story, but the whispers grew stronger. Ward's flat, once a haven of art and laughter, now felt heavy with unseen eyes. Christine must have felt it. The way conversations fell quiet when she entered, the way men exchanged glances over her shoulder. She was still young, still learning the ways of a world built on appearances. But even she could not mistake the shift. What had once been exhilaration now carried dread. She was no longer simply admired, she was watched. In those evenings when Ivanov was present, Christine may have felt a strange pull. He represented another world, foreign, dangerous, yet also captivating. He listened, he smiled, He treated her with a kind of solemn respect that contrasted with the hurried, furtive attention she now received from Profumo. Perhaps she wondered which man saw her more clearly, the minister who hid her in shadows, or the attaché who asked questions in the open. Yet neither saw her as herself. To both, she was a figure in a larger game. Her beauty and youth turned into tokens of value she did not choose. The danger was invisible, yet palpable. In the Cold War, even rumor was enough to destroy, and Christine was becoming the embodiment of rumor itself. She carried with her the suspicion of secrets passing from pillow to embassy, of whispers exchanged between sheets and slipped into drawers. Whether true or not mattered little. What mattered was the story, and the story was already forming, waiting only for the moment it would break into the open. Christine walked through those days as though through fog, uncertain of the ground beneath her. She moved between men, between rooms, between worlds, each step carrying her further into shadows. She may have told herself that she was free, that she was choosing her path, but the truth was less kind. She was being carried, drawn, placed, her movements observed, her choices framed by others. She was no longer simply a girl seeking recognition. She was becoming a symbol of danger, of scandal, of betrayal, even before she understood the role she played. And yet, in quiet moments, she remained the same Christine, the girl who longed for warmth, who dreamed of belonging, who wanted only to escape the poverty of her childhood. She laughed, she danced, she posed for photographs, she lived as though tomorrow might still bring joy. But beneath each smile there was unease, beneath each laugh a shadow, beneath each photograph the suspicion that her image carried more than she intended. The rustle of papers returned, echoing in her memory the sound of secrets hidden, of truths recorded. Somewhere, in some office, her name was already written, her connections already noted, her movements already mapped. She could not see it, but she felt it, a chill beneath the warmth of champagne and perfume. And in the distance, as the night deepened, there was the faint sound of footsteps again, not retreating this time, but approaching, slow, deliberate, inevitable. The footsteps that had seemed so faint, so distant, now drew closer, their approach accompanied not by silence, but by the sharp crackle of newspapers, the rustling of pages heavy with ink. One morning, Christine awoke to find her own face staring back at her from headlines, the familiar curve of her features rendered strange by the harshness of print. The press had arrived, and with it the sudden shift from private whispers to public spectacle. Where once her name had been spoken in hushed tones, in drawing rooms and corridors, it was now carried in bold letters across the country, shouted from newsstands, read aloud in pubs, murmured in offices. The scandal had begun its slow burn, the fragments of her life pieced together by those who had been watching, waiting for the moment to strike. She was no longer only Christine Keeler, the young showgirl drifting between clubs and salons. She'd become a figure of curiosity, of accusation, of moral panic. The affair with John Profumo, once hidden behind locked doors, was now suggested in print, cloaked in insinuation yet clear enough for those who wished to see. And the shadow of Yevgeny Ivanov, the Soviet attaché, darkened the story further, transforming whispers of romance into allegations of espionage. Christine walked the streets differently now. The same eyes that had once admired her with casual interest now lingered with judgment, with hunger, with suspicion. She felt the gaze of strangers, sharper than any she had known before, as though the city itself had turned its attention upon her. Each step became a performance, each gesture a subject of scrutiny. She was hunted not by men in shadows, but by cameras, by pens, by the relentless appetite of a public eager for scandal. The newspapers told stories of her that bore only fragments of truth. They painted her as seductress, as deceiver, as a danger to the very fabric of the nation. They relished every detail of her beauty, her movements, her supposed indiscretions. Photographs of her circulated endlessly, each one framed not as art, but as evidence. Christine saw herself reflected in these pages and felt a hollow recognition. The woman they described was not herself, not the child of poverty, not the girl who had once dreamed of silk and laughter. She had become an invention, a myth woven from desire and fear. Ward's flat, once filled with laughter and music, now felt besieged. Reporters lingered outside, their questions sharp, their flashbulbs blinding. Guests who had once flocked there now stayed away, fearful of being caught in the glare. Ward himself grew anxious, his charm thinning beneath the pressure, his control slipping. He had once been the orchestrator, but now he too was caught in the net, his name linked with Christine's in every headline. The gatherings that had seemed enchanted now revealed themselves as fragile illusions, collapsing under the weight of exposure. Christine felt the walls closing in. She had sought recognition, but not like this. She had longed to be seen, but not to be judged. The attention that once lifted her now crushed her, leaving her breathless, desperate, uncertain of where to turn. Friends grew scarce. Trust dissolved. Those who had once flattered her now distanced themselves, fearing contamination by her scandal. She was left standing alone in the storm, her figure illuminated not by chandeliers, but by the harsh white light of the press. The scandal grew, fueled by every rumor, every half-truth. The public devoured the story, for it combined all that stirred curiosity and fear, sex, power, betrayal, and the shadow of a foreign enemy. Christine's name became synonymous with danger, her face the emblem of a government teetering on the edge of disgrace. She was accused not only of infidelity, but of treachery, of placing the nation itself at risk. Yet through it all, she remained a young woman, scarcely past childhood, bewildered by the storm that had risen around her. At night, when the noise of the day faded, she must have listened to the silence and wondered how it had come to this. She had not sought to shake governments, had not intended to become a symbol of scandal. She had only sought warmth, affection, escape from poverty. And yet here she was, her life no longer her own, her story told by others, her truth drowned beneath layers of invention. Did she feel guilt or anger or only exhaustion? Perhaps she felt all at once, a weight too heavy for her slender frame. The crackle of newspapers grew louder, relentless. Each morning brought new headlines, new accusations, new interpretations of her life. Christine could not control the story, could not shape the words written about her. She was at the mercy of the press, of politicians, of the public appetite for scandal. And as the noise grew, the truth became harder to see, lost amid the glare of attention. One evening, sitting alone, she unfolded a paper and saw herself staring back once more. The image was familiar, yet the woman in the picture seemed a stranger, her smile interpreted as sly, her eyes as dangerous. Christine looked at the page until the letters blurred, until the crackle of the paper was the only sound in the room. She let it slip from her fingers, falling to the floor with a soft thud, its headline still bold, still accusing. The sound of the paper echoed faintly like the rustle of wings, and in the quiet that followed, Christine felt the weight of silence pressing close. The newspaper lay upon the floor, its pages splayed like wings, stilled in flight, the headline glaring upward in letters too large to ignore. In those bold words, Christine's name was bound to scandal. But in Westminster, another drama was unfolding, one that would soon echo more loudly than any printed line. For John Profumo, pressed by whispers that would no longer remain contained, rose before Parliament to speak, his voice carrying the authority of office, the assurance of a man accustomed to being believed. He denied the affair with Christine, denied impropriety, denied the whispers that had grown into accusations. His words were iron steady, delivered with the calm certainty of one who believes that denial, spoken firmly enough, can still the storm. In the chamber, the silence was heavy, every ear straining, every gaze fixed. Profumo's denial was not only a defense of himself, but of government itself, of the fragile structure of trust upon which public life depended. To admit to the truth would have been ruinous, not only for him, but for the Prime Minister and the party he served. So he chose denial, swearing that Christine was nothing more than an acquaintance, that rumors of intimacy were false, that his honor remained untarnished. The words carried weight, and for a time they held. Parliament accepted his statement, the House of Commons bowed to the authority of his oath, and the storm seemed, briefly, to recede. Yet Christine knew the truth. She sat apart from those chambers of power, her life already dissected in newspapers, her image already judged by strangers, and listened as the man who had once whispered tenderness behind locked doors now stood before the nation and declared her irrelevant, denied her existence as anything more than a passing figure. How must it have felt to hear herself erased so thoroughly, to be stripped not only of affection but of truth itself? The denial was more than political, it was personal, a silencing of her voice, a negation of her memory. In Ward's rooms, the talk turned sharper. Guests who had once lingered in laughter now muttered in unease. Ward himself seemed unsettled, his eyes watchful, his words more measured. He had introduced Christine to Profumo, had played the silent hand that guided them together, and now he, too, was caught in the tightening noose of suspicion. The denial in Parliament had steadied the government, but it had not erased the story. It had only deepened the divide between public words and private truth, and into that divide the press poured more questions, more speculation, more determination to uncover what was hidden. Christine felt the contradiction keenly. She was known everywhere now, yet her own voice carried no weight. The newspapers spoke for her, Parliament spoke against her, but she herself was left unheard, a figure upon whom others projected their fears and desires. She carried the burden of being visible, yet silenced, recognized, yet denied. And the denial itself, so firm, so absolute, only sharpened the hunger of those who doubted it. For when a man in power swears too strongly, does it not stir suspicion that he has something to hide? The days grew heavy with scrutiny. Reporters sought her out. Questions pressed upon her, her life examined in every detail. She moved through the city like one pursued, her steps echoing with the knowledge that eyes were always upon her. She could not escape the shadow of Parliament's denial, nor could she escape the gnawing knowledge that truth itself had become a weapon turned against her. What is truth? When spoken by the powerful, it becomes denial, and when spoken by the powerless, it is dismissed as deceit. Christine lived that paradox, her very life caught in its cruel balance. For Profumo, the denial was a reprieve, but only temporary. In the echo of his words there remained an unease, a sense that the story had not ended but merely paused. The press did not relent. Ward's circle continued to unravel, and Christine's name lingered too heavily in the air to be dismissed. The denial steadied the government for a season, yet beneath it, the storm gathered strength, preparing for the moment when it would break again with greater force. Christine, caught in the silence after his speech, must have felt both betrayed and erased. The man who had once turned to her in laughter now turned from her in scorn. The intimacy they had shared was denied with a single stroke of words, leaving her not only abandoned, but discredited. She had no parliament to stand in, no chamber to command with her voice. She had only her own fragile presence, and the echo of her name repeated in headlines she did not write. One evening, as the day's newspapers lay crumpled on cafe tables, Christine sat in a dimly lit room. the sound of a gavel echoing faintly from a wireless broadcast, replaying the words spoken in Parliament. The gavel struck, sealing the denial as fact in the record of the House. The sound was sharp, decisive, final. Christine closed her eyes, hearing in that strike not truth but erasure, not justice but silence. The room smelled of stale smoke. The window panes reflected the blurred lights of the street, and she sat alone, caught between the world's gaze and its refusal to hear her. The gavel echoed again in her memory, each strike harder than the last, each one driving the wedge deeper between her life and her truth. Outside, the night pressed against the glass, silent, unyielding. Inside, the air grew heavy with the weight of denial. She wondered perhaps if the sound would ever fade, or if it would follow her always, the mark of a moment when her existence was publicly unmade. The gavel's echo did not fade as Christine hoped it might. Instead, it seemed to reverberate more loudly with each passing day, a sound remembered in Parliament, yet haunting also the quiet corners of her own life. The denial spoken with such firmness had steadied the government for a fleeting moment, but denials are fragile things, brittle shells that crack when pressed too hard, and soon enough the weight of truth, carried in whispers and in documents, pressed too strongly to be contained. The day came when John Profumo, no longer able to bear the mounting evidence, confessed. The denial that had been struck like iron now melted into admission, and with it the government itself trembled as though a great tower were leaning, ready to fall. The confession was delivered not with grandeur, but with resignation, his words quieter than before, as though spoken by a man who had aged years in the span of weeks. He admitted to the affair with Christine, admitted to misleading Parliament, admitted to betraying the trust upon which his office depended. The very act of confession was ruinous, for in politics the lie is sometimes forgiven, but the exposure of the lie rarely is. Profumo resigned. His career ended in disgrace, his name forever linked to scandal. For him, it was the collapse of ambition, the end of a public life carefully built over decades. For Christine, it was something altogether different. She was thrust into a light far harsher than before. When he had denied her, she had been erased, diminished, dismissed as unworthy of truth. Now, in his confession, she was restored only as symbol, not as person. She became the woman who had undone a man of power, the girl whose presence had rocked a government, the face of scandal that newspapers could not resist. Her image was splashed across front pages once more, not only in England but abroad, her name spoken in tones of fascination, of condemnation, of lust, of judgment. She had longed to be seen, but this was not the sight she had imagined. The weight of public scrutiny grew unbearable. Wherever she walked, eyes followed, whispers rose, judgments lingered. She was cast not only as seductress, but as betrayer, a danger to the nation itself, a girl whose beauty had toppled men and endangered secrets. Few paused to ask what role she had truly played, how much was choice, and how much was circumstance. Few wondered whether she had been used by Ward, by Profumo, by Ivanov, by all of them in turn. The story needed a villainess, and Christine became its chosen figure. The government shook under the scandal. Questions were asked not only of Profumo, but of Macmillan's cabinet, of the structures that had allowed such vulnerability. How could a minister of state compromise himself with a girl so young, especially one linked, however faintly, to a Soviet diplomat? The Cold War loomed large, and in its shadow the scandal became not only personal, but political, a symbol of weakness, of betrayal, of moral decay at the highest levels. Christine, caught in the middle, became both weapon and scapegoat. Her name was invoked to wound the government, to question its integrity, to erode its strength, and yet In the midst of all this, she remained a young woman, scarcely into her 20s, bewildered, frightened, and alone. She must have listened to the broadcasts of his confession with a strange mixture of emotions, relief, perhaps, that the truth had at last been spoken, that she was no longer denied, but also bitterness, for the truth had not restored her, only deepened her entanglement in the scandal. Profumo confessed his sin and retreated into obscurity, supported by wealth, by status, by family, Christine, by contrast, was left exposed, without the protections of power, cast into the glare of publicity with nothing to shield her. His fall was political, hers was personal, merciless, inescapable. Ward, too, was ensnared, his name bound to hers, his gatherings painted not as salons of art and society, but as brothels of corruption. His charm, once admired, was now recast as deceit, his role as orchestrator condemned as exploitation. The circle that had once seemed enchanted now appeared sordid, its glamour revealed as facade. Christine saw her companions abandon her, saw doors close, saw trust dissolve. She'd been welcomed in laughter, but abandoned in disgrace. The newspapers wrote endlessly, their headlines shifting from denial to confession to collapse. Christine's face became more familiar than that of any starlet or politician, yet with each repetition her identity grew thinner, reduced to an image, a symbol, a name attached to scandal. She was rarely allowed to speak, and when she did, her words were twisted, framed as further proof of her guilt. Her story was no longer hers. It belonged to the nation, to the press, to those who found in her an object upon which to project fear, anger, and desire. At night she must have sat alone, the noise of the day echoing in her mind, and wondered whether she had ever been seen as herself. Profumo had denied her, then confessed to her, yet neither act had recognized her humanity. Ward had introduced her, encouraged her, displayed her, yet never protected her. The newspapers had exalted her image, then condemned it, yet never sought her truth. She was a figure in their stories, but never the author of her own. The tower leaned further, its collapse imminent. The Prime Minister's health faltered under the weight of scandal. The public's trust eroded. The government weakened. All this was linked, in the minds of many, to Christine's name. She became the emblem of a nation's disillusionment, the symbol of corruption revealed, the face of betrayal. Yet beneath the weight of symbolism, she was still Christine, a young woman walking streets alone, her steps uncertain, her heart heavy, her future clouded. The night deepened, and in her small room she stared at the shadows on the wall. She thought of Profumo's confession, of the tower trembling, of her own life unraveling. The silence was heavy, yet within it she heard again the echo of footsteps, the sound of doors closing, of laughter fading. She was left with images unresolved, of towers leaning, of lives collapsing, of her own face reflected endlessly in newspapers that told only part of her truth. The image of the tower lingered, leaning still, as though frozen in the moment before the fall. The image of the tower leaning, suspended in that moment before collapse, gave way to another stage where collapse would be made visible not in metaphor, but in the hard light of law. The trial of Stephen Ward began, and Christine, whose name had already been etched into scandal, now found herself summoned into a courtroom heavy with expectation, the air itself thick with judgment. The laughter and smoke of Ward's gatherings were replaced by the silence of benches, the rustle of robes, the scratch of pens. Where once she had been admired in shadowed rooms, she was now dissected in public. Her every word weighed, her every gesture scrutinized. Ward, once the gracious host, the smiling orchestrator of connections, now sat hunched in the dock, his face drawn, his charm diminished. He was charged not with treason or espionage, as rumors had suggested, but with immorality. living off the earnings of prostitution, exploiting the young women who had drifted into his circle. Yet beneath the formal language of the charges lay something larger, something less spoken. He was on trial not only for his actions, but for the scandal that had engulfed a government, for the embarrassment of those who had once counted him as friend. The court became the place where society itself sought to cleanse its shame by casting blame upon him. Christine was called to the stand, her presence both demanded and despised. She stood in the witness box, the eyes of the court upon her, the weight of the nation pressing down. She was still so young, yet she had aged in the months of scandal, her features sharpened by strain, her voice unsteady, yet determined. She spoke of her acquaintance with Ward, of her time in his flat, of the connections he had arranged. She spoke of Profumo, of Ivanov, of the overlapping worlds that had collided within those walls. But as she spoke, she felt the judgment not only upon him, but upon herself. The questions came hard, precise, meant not only to uncover, but to wound. The barristers pressed her, seeking inconsistencies, twisting her words, reminding her at every turn that she was not to be trusted. She was painted as unreliable, as reckless, as corrupt. Her testimony framed as tainted by her very existence. The courtroom that should have been a place of truth became another theater of spectacle, with Christine once again its unwilling star. She had longed once to be seen, but here she was seen too clearly. Her life laid bare under lights that revealed only flaws. Ward listened as she spoke, his expression unreadable. Did he feel betrayed by her presence, or did he understand that she too was trapped, her role scripted by forces beyond her control? Their bond, once framed by laughter and music, was now fractured by accusation and defense, by the machinery of law that cared nothing for affection or memory. Christine, testifying, must have felt the distance between them, the impossibility of reclaiming what had once seemed enchanted. The press filled the gallery, their pens scratching, their eyes eager. Every word she spoke was recorded, printed, magnified, twisted into headlines that would echo beyond the courtroom. Christine's testimony was not only evidence, it was story, entertainment, spectacle. The nation consumed her again, not as person but as symbol, her voice distorted by the hunger of others. She left the stand with the sense that she had not been heard but used, her presence serving not to illuminate truth, but to decorate the spectacle of Ward's fall. And Ward did fall. The trial proceeded, witnesses spoke, evidence was presented, and the image of him as charming host dissolved into one of manipulator, exploiter, villain. The verdict loomed, and with it a sentence he could not endure. Before judgment could be pronounced, Ward took his own life, leaving behind silence heavier than any gavel. His absence became its own verdict, his death a confession in the eyes of many, though to others it was proof of injustice, of a man destroyed to protect the powerful. Christine, learning of his death, felt the weight of it as though it were her own burden. She had been drawn into his circle, had lived under his roof, had laughed at his gatherings, and now she was left with the echo of his absence. The courtroom emptied, but the silence remained. Christine walked away not free but haunted, carrying with her the memory of his face, the sound of his voice, the knowledge that her testimony had been part of his undoing. Did she blame herself? Or did she see him as architect of his own fall? Perhaps both, for truth in such matters is never clear, never clean. She carried his death with her, as she carried the scandal, as she carried the weight of her own choices and the choices forced upon her. Outside the courtroom, the press descended once more. Cameras flashed, questions flew, voices clamored. Christine faced them with the same weary defiance she had learned to wear like armor, but beneath it she was exhausted, fractured, uncertain of how much more she could endure. She was not the girl who had once dreamed of silk dresses and bright lights. She was the woman marked by scandal, haunted by death, condemned by words spoken in courtrooms and printed in ink. The silence of the empty courtroom lingered with her long after. The image of the dock, the witness box, the judge's bench burned into her memory. It was not a place of justice but of spectacle, not a search for truth, but a performance for the nation's catharsis. Christine left it with her life changed once more, her name darker, her future dimmer, her heart heavier. She was no longer only the girl who had rocked the establishment. She was also the woman who had witnessed a friend's destruction, who had stood in a place where truth and lies had merged into a single, suffocating fog. The gavel did not strike that final day, for Ward had already written his own ending. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound could have been. Christine stepped into it, her footsteps echoing softly, unresolved, carrying her into a future that seemed at once inevitable and uncertain. The silence remained, as though the courtroom itself held its breath, and in that breath, Christine felt the weight of absence, the knowledge that the story was not finished, only paused. The silence of the courtroom lingered long after the crowds had dispersed, a silence heavier than any verdict could have been, for it carried within it the absence of Stephen Ward. His death had fallen like a shadow across the scandal, abrupt yet inevitable, the final act of a man who could not bear the weight of judgment. Christine carried that silence with her, the memory of his face etched into her mind, the echo of his voice, now stilled forever. Where once there had been laughter in his rooms, the clink of glasses, the smell of perfume and smoke, there was now only emptiness, a space that no gathering could fill. She felt the guilt press against her, though none had spoken it directly. She had testified against him, had stood in the witness box as he listened, had become part of the machinery that brought him low. She told herself she had no choice, that she, too, had been summoned, pressed, cornered by questions that offered no escape. Yet guilt does not bend easily to reason. It lingers in the quiet moments, in the dark of night, in the solitude of memory. She wondered if he had cursed her name in his final hours, or if he had thought of her kindly, as friend, as companion, as victim like himself. She would never know, and it was the not knowing that haunted her most. Ward's death reshaped the scandal. For many, it was proof of his guilt, the final confirmation that the charges had been just. For others, it was evidence of injustice, a man destroyed not by his crimes but by the weight of political necessity, sacrificed to shield the powerful. Christine stood caught between these interpretations, her own grief twisted into a public debate. She could not mourn him privately. Even her sorrow was consumed by headlines, her tears transformed into spectacle. She was asked what she felt, what she thought, as though grief could be translated into quotable lines. But grief does not speak in neat sentences. It lingers, heavy, shapeless, unresolved. At night, Christine thought of the rooms where Ward had once held court, their curtains drawn, their lamps glowing, the air thick with laughter. She remembered his sketches, the quick stroke of his hand across paper, the way he captured faces with ease. She remembered his charm, his wit, the way he made her feel part of something larger, and she remembered also the unease, the sense of being watched, of being placed in positions she did not choose. He had been protector and exploiter both, friend and manipulator, savior and destroyer. In his death, he became even more difficult to grasp, his image fractured, his role contested, his memory burdened. Christine was left alone in the wake of his absence, more exposed than ever. Ward had been a shield of sorts, however flawed, a figure who stood between her and the full fury of the establishment. With him gone, the storm turned more fully upon her. She was the one who remained, the one who could still be questioned, still be judged, still be condemned. His silence became her burden, his death her inheritance. The newspapers, insatiable, shifted their gaze more tightly upon her, for she was the living face of the scandal now, the one who could still be pursued. The guilt did not diminish with time. She carried it with her as she walked the streets, as she sat in dim rooms, as she lay awake in the long hours of night. She wondered whether she had betrayed him by speaking, whether she could have spoken differently, whether she could have saved him. Yet she knew also that she, too, had been betrayed, drawn into his circle, placed in a position she could never have controlled. Their lives had been intertwined, tangled in ways neither fully understood, and now his death had severed the knot, leaving her to carry both halves of the story, alone. There were moments when she thought she saw him still, his figure lingering in the corner of a room, his smile faint, his voice whispering. Memory and imagination blurred, grief shaping ghosts that would not depart. She felt him watching, not accusing, not forgiving, only present, as though his absence was too heavy to vanish entirely. She walked through the city with that ghost beside her, unseen by others, felt only by her. It was a haunting not of malice but of unfinishedness, of questions left unanswered, of bonds severed too soon. The public grew restless, their appetite for scandal unsated. Christine was hounded still, her movements followed, her face photographed, her words twisted. She was expected to carry not only her own story but his, to answer for his choices as well as her own, to bear the weight of a man's death as though it were proof of her guilt. She was condemned not by verdict but by perception, judged not in court but in the streets, in the pages of newspapers, in the whispers of strangers. Yet beneath the guilt, beneath the grief, there was also anger. Anger at Ward for drawing her into his circle, anger at Profumo for denying and abandoning her, anger at the establishment for casting her as scapegoat, anger at the press for devouring her life without care. Anger and grief mingled until she could not separate them, until her memories of Ward were as much reproach as sorrow. He had been many things to her, but above all, he had been the one who opened the door to the life that had destroyed her. His death left her with sorrow, but also with rage at the path he had led her down. And so Christine drifted through those days, haunted and hunted, burdened and bitter. The scandal had already consumed her youth, and now it consumed her memories, her relationships, her very sense of self. She was not allowed to mourn in silence, not allowed to forget, not allowed to heal. Ward's death was not an end, but another weight added to the chain around her. She carried it forward, each step heavier, the silence of the courtroom echoing still in her mind. One evening, alone in her room, Christine lit a candle, the small flame flickering in the dimness. She watched the wax drip slowly down its side, pooling at the base, and thought of Ward's candle burning low on the mantel all those months before. The flame danced, unsteady, fragile, and she wondered if this too was how all lives ended, not with a verdict, not with a headline, but with a flicker and a silence. She blew it out gently, and in the darkness that followed, the memory of Ward remained, a ghost that would not leave. The single light had been extinguished, and the room was left in silence once more. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence, heavy, lingering, unresolved. Christine sat in the dark, feeling the weight of it press close, knowing it would follow her into the next chapter, knowing that the haunting had only begun. The candle's flame had been blown out, leaving Christine in a room filled with darkness, its silence pressing against her like a heavy cloak. Yet even in that silence, she could not rest, for the world outside had not finished with her. Ward's death had not closed the scandal. It had sharpened its edges, and now those edges turned toward her. From the silence of the extinguished flame, she was carried into another chamber, not of laughter, not of secrecy, not even of Ward's ill-fated trial, but her own. Christine herself would stand before the court, not as witness this time, but as accused. The charge was perjury, and with it came the promise of prison, of chains, of gates that would shut behind her with finality. She had spoken before under oath, her words fragile, faltering, pressed by questions she could scarcely withstand. Now those same words were turned against her, painted as falsehoods, twisted into evidence of guilt. The world had already judged her in newspapers and whispers, but now it sought to judge her formally, to brand her with conviction, to lock her away. Christine entered the courtroom with weary steps, her face pale, her figure slender, carrying herself with the quiet dignity of one who knows she cannot win but refuses to bow. The barristers circled her with sharp words, their voices polished, their arguments honed. They spoke of deceit, of betrayal, of false testimony. They painted her not as victim but as schemer, not as girl but as temptress, a woman who had lied for gain, who had perverted justice. Christine listened, her heart heavy, her hands trembling slightly, and wondered whether anyone in that room saw her as she was, whether anyone cared to see beyond the mask of scandal. The court was not searching for truth, it was searching for blame, and she was the nearest figure upon whom blame could rest. Her defense was weak, not for lack of truth, but for lack of power. She had no allies in that chamber, no shield against the accusations. Her past was thrown before her as proof of guilt, her youth in poverty, her time in Soho, her association with Ward, her affairs with powerful men. Each detail was sharpened into a weapon, each memory turned against her. She was not allowed to be Christine the person. She was Christine the scandal, Christine the perjurer, Christine the fallen woman. The jury listened, their faces unreadable, their silence heavier than any words. Christine spoke, her voice steady at times, faltering at others, but she knew that her words could not pierce the fog of judgment that filled the room. She was condemned before the verdict, guilty before the sentence, her fate already written in the pages of newspapers that lay folded in the jurors' pockets. The trial was performance, the outcome inevitable, the sentence a matter of form. When the verdict came, it was no surprise. She was declared guilty, the word ringing in her ears like the toll of a bell. The sentence followed swiftly, 9 months in prison. The room blurred before her eyes, the faces merging into a single sea of judgment. She heard the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of feet, the murmur of voices, but above it all was the sound of the gavel striking wood, sharp, final, cruel. She was led away, her steps unsteady, her body trembling, her heart sinking deeper than it had ever sunk before. The gates closed behind her with a metallic clang that echoed in her bones. Prison was not merely confinement, it was erasure. She was stripped of her name, her image, her identity, reduced to a number, a body, a prisoner. The world outside continued to whisper, to laugh, to condemn, but inside she was left in silence, the walls pressing close, the chains clinking faintly in the dark. She lay on a narrow bed, the air damp, the light dim, and wondered how her life had led her here. She thought of the caravan of her childhood, of the laughter in Ward's rooms, of the gardens of Cliveden, of Profumo's whispered words. All of it seemed impossibly distant, part of another life, another world. In prison, she was not admired, not envied, not photographed. She was forgotten, or so it seemed, left alone with her thoughts, her guilt, her bitterness. Yet even there she could not escape the memory of Ward's death, of Profumo's denial, of the press's relentless hunger. The scandal followed her like a shadow, even through the iron gates. She was Christine Keeler, the woman who had rocked the establishment, and no bars could strip her of that unwanted title. She carried it like a brand, burned into her skin, a mark she could never erase. The days passed slowly, marked only by routine, by silence, by the faint clinking of chains in the corridor. Christine counted them, not in hope, but in endurance. Each one a weight carried, each one a step closer to release, yet also deeper into disillusionment. She thought of freedom, but freedom itself had changed. Once she had dreamed of freedom as escape into light, into silk and music and laughter. Now she dreamed only of release from judgment, from scrutiny, from the endless eyes of strangers. Yet she knew that beyond the prison walls, those eyes still waited, hungrier than ever, ready to consume her once more. When she slept, her dreams were filled with echoes. The sound of the gavel, the clang of gates, the whispers of Ward, the footsteps of Profumo retreating into the night. She awoke with the taste of fear in her mouth, the weight of absence pressing on her chest. She wondered if she would ever escape those echoes, or if they would follow her forever, shadows that clung even when no light remained. One night, lying awake on the narrow bed, she heard the faint sound of chains clinking in the distance, metal against stone, hollow and cold. The sound seemed endless, repeating, reverberating through the corridors. She listened, her eyes open in the dark, and felt it sink into her bones. It was the sound of confinement, of judgment, of a life bound not by her own choices but by the weight of others. The clinking grew softer, then faded, leaving only silence. But in that silence, Christine felt the presence of the chains still, invisible, unbroken, binding her even beyond the prison walls. The faint clink of chains lingered in her ears long after they had faded into silence. And when at last the prison gates opened to release her, Christine stepped out carrying not freedom, but the echo of confinement. The iron had been removed from her wrists, yet the weight of it remained invisible upon her, a burden she would never quite lay down. The world beyond the walls was changed, or perhaps it was she who had changed. Once she had imagined that freedom would feel like sunlight pouring over her, like laughter waiting at the door, but now it felt uncertain, hollow, fragile. The air was wider, yes, the streets noisier, the sky larger, yet all of it pressed upon her with the knowledge that the eyes of strangers still followed, still judged, still whispered. She returned not to the glamour she had once brushed against, but to poverty, to obscurity, to rooms barely furnished and cupboards half empty. The scandal that had once placed her on every front page had left her with nothing, no security, no wealth, no friends to speak of. Work was scarce, for who would employ the woman whose name had been bound to scandal, whose face had become a symbol of shame? She tried here and there, modeling, dancing, odd jobs, but each attempt dissolved under the weight of her name. She was not Christine the girl, not Christine the worker. She was Christine Keeler, the woman who had brought down a minister, the woman who had haunted Parliament, the woman the world had already decided upon. The days stretched, marked by small struggles, by attempts to live quietly. She cooked simple meals, walked streets where once she had been photographed, lingered in rooms that smelled of damp. The glamour of champagne and silk had faded, leaving behind cracked mirrors and second-hand clothes. Yet even in this reduced life, she could not escape the shadow of her past. Strangers recognized her, some with curiosity, some with contempt. They whispered her name as she passed, some asking questions, some hurling accusations, some laughing as though her life were theirs to mock. She bore it quietly, her head lowered, her heart aching with the knowledge that she was remembered not for who she was, but for what she had been made to represent. And still, she dreamed. At night, in the silence of her small rooms, she dreamed of applause, of cameras flashing in admiration rather than accusation, of stages where she could stand not as scandal but as star. The memory of those early years lingered, the times when she had been admired in clubs, when she had been noticed, when her beauty had seemed a gift rather than a curse. She dreamed of returning to that, of reclaiming her life, of being more than the figure the newspapers had carved her into. But each morning she awoke to the same cracked walls, the same silence, the same weight of chains no longer visible, yet never gone. She was invited from time to time to revisit the scandal, to tell her story once more. Publishers, journalists, television men came to her door, their eyes gleaming with curiosity, their questions sharp. They wanted her words not for her sake, but for their profit, their headlines, their sales. She told her story in fragments, sometimes for money, sometimes for the faint hope of reclaiming her voice. But even as she spoke, her words were reshaped, retold, reframed. She remained a symbol, never a woman. She remained Christine the scandal, never Christine the person. In the quiet moments, she thought often of her childhood, of the caravan where she had slept, of the damp streets of Uxbridge, of the hunger and longing that had carried her into Soho, into Ward's circle, into Profumo's gaze. She wondered whether she had ever truly escaped, whether she had ever truly lived beyond those beginnings, or whether every step she had taken had only been another turn in a circle leading her back to emptiness. Poverty had been the beginning, and it was the end also, though now burdened with the added weight of infamy. There were times when she laughed still, when memories of small joys returned. A walk by the river, a song heard on the radio, the laughter of her own child when she was later blessed with motherhood. These moments pierced the gloom, fleeting yet precious. They reminded her that life, even marked by scandal, could still hold tenderness. Yet even these joys were fragile, overshadowed by the endless return of her past. She could not tell a joke without someone recalling a headline, could not smile without someone muttering her name. The cracked mirror on her wall reflected her face back at her, older now, wearier. The brightness of youth dimmed. She looked at herself and saw fragments, as though the mirror showed not one Christine, but many. The child in the caravan, the showgirl in Soho, the mistress in Cliveden, the prisoner behind bars. Each reflection gazed back, none reconciled, none whole. She reached out once to touch the glass, her finger tracing the fracture, and wondered if she would ever be whole again. And so Christine lived in the margins, not forgotten, but not forgiven, not admired, but not erased. She was present, visible, remembered, yet never allowed to move beyond the story that had claimed her. The applause she once dreamed of never returned. The headlines remained, but they carried only scandal, never redemption. She existed in a twilight space, her life both lived and consumed, her presence both real and symbolic. One evening, sitting alone in her narrow room, she heard again the faint sound of applause. Not in the street, not in reality, but in her memory. It came faintly like an echo from another life, laughter and clapping blending with the music of some long-forgotten club. She closed her eyes, listening, and for a moment she was young again, standing beneath a spotlight, her figure graceful, her face radiant, her name spoken with admiration rather than scorn. She smiled faintly, then opened her eyes to the silence of the room. The applause had faded, leaving only the hum of the city outside, the sound of traffic, the sigh of the wind. She looked at the cracked mirror once more, and in its broken reflection she saw the ghost of that applause lingering still, a memory that belonged to her alone. The cracked mirror caught the dim light of the lamp, its fragments glinting faintly, as though each shard reflected a piece of her life, scattered and unresolved. Christine turned away from it, but the broken image remained in her mind, lingering as she moved into another uncertain day. The cracked mirror glimmered faintly in the lamplight, each shard reflecting back a fragment of Christine's face, a face no longer entirely her own. For even as she turned away, she knew that her image had long since slipped from her grasp. It was no longer the reflection she saw in private, but the countless reproductions that filled newspapers, magazines, television screens. The world had taken her likeness and remade it, repeating it endlessly until the woman herself dissolved behind the symbol. Media fascination did not fade with the years. It persisted, feeding on her story, returning to it again and again, unable to let her slip quietly into obscurity. She had become, against her will, a figure to be revisited whenever scandal was remembered, whenever history sought its cautionary tales. Christine understood the strange cruelty of this repetition. She could not walk a street nor sit in a cafe without sensing the lingering recognition in strangers' eyes. Some looked with curiosity, others with pity, still others with contempt. She had been beautiful, and beauty in the public imagination is never permitted to fade gently. It is seized upon, idealized, vilified, remembered, but never allowed to belong solely to its owner. Her beauty had once opened doors, had once promised escape from poverty. Now it bound her, repeated endlessly in images chosen not to honor her, but to remind the world of scandal. Journalists continued to seek her out. They knocked at her door, sent letters, offered money for her story retold. Some came with polite curiosity, others with predatory eagerness, all hungry for fresh detail, for some new angle to a story already told 1,000 times. Christine spoke at times, for she needed money, and what else could she sell but her own tale? Yet each telling left her diminished, each retelling less her own. Her voice was filtered, reframed, stripped of nuance. The Christine who spoke was never the Christine who appeared in print. She was edited into caricature, into cautionary figure, into a symbol of fallen beauty, of betrayal, of ruin. The years passed, and still the fascination did not release her. New scandals arose, new figures filled the headlines, yet Christine remained tethered to her own. Periodically, the world returned to her, dredging her up from the quiet life she attempted to live, parading her name once more. She had become part of the national memory, but not as a person, only as scandal embodied. There was no kindness in this memory, only a relentless appetite for repetition. Christine herself grew weary of it, the endless cycle of fascination and judgment. She longed to be forgotten, to slip quietly into anonymity, to be Christine the woman rather than Christine the story. But forgetting was not granted to her. The media had created an image that could not be erased, and she lived in its shadow. She knew that whatever she did, wherever she went, she would never be free. She would always be the woman who had rocked the establishment, the girl at the center of the Profumo Affair, the name that carried scandal like a stain that would not wash out. In the quiet moments, Christine wondered if this was her punishment, not prison, not judgment in a courtroom, but the endless denial of obscurity. To live on not as herself, but as repetition, to be remembered but never known. She had dreamed once of fame, of applause, of being admired, but this was something different, something colder. She was not admired, she was consumed. Her life had become a spectacle, her image a commodity, her name a headline that could be used whenever the world wished to remember its past shames. And yet, for all the cruelty of it, there was also a strange persistence. Christine endured, long after governments had changed, long after politicians had faded, long after the scandal itself had lost its urgency. She remained, her name still known, her image still recalled. She was not erased, though she often wished she had been. She was remembered, though never as she truly was. The flashbulbs followed her even into later years, their sudden light startling her in the street, at her door, in moments she thought private. Each burst of light was like a theft, another piece of her taken, reproduced, sold. She shielded her face, turned away, but still the images appeared, frozen in time, presented as evidence of who she was. The world saw her through those images, not through her eyes, not through her truth. One evening, walking home under a pale streetlight, she felt the sudden burst of a flash, bright against the night. The photographer did not ask, did not wait, only took, his camera clicking rapidly. Christine turned, her expression weary, and in that moment she understood that this too would be printed, repeated, consumed. The flash faded, leaving behind only darkness, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the night. She walked on, her figure swallowed by shadow, the lingering burst of light still imprinted on her eyes. At home, she sat before the cracked mirror once more. The fragments reflected her face in pieces, fractured, scattered. She touched the glass lightly, tracing the lines, and thought of the flash bulbs bursting outside, of her image multiplied beyond her control. The mirror showed her in fragments, but so too did the world. She had never been allowed to be whole. Only fragments, only symbols, only repetition. She leaned back in her chair, the room dim, the air still. The silence pressed close, broken only by the faint hum of the city outside. She thought of the applause she once dreamed of the headlines that had once thrilled her, of the recognition she had once longed for. Now she longed only for quiet, for obscurity, for the gift of being unseen. Yet even in the silence she knew that the fascination would return, that her name would be spoken again, her face printed again, her story retold again. Outside, another flashbulb burst in the night, unseen by her yet felt nonetheless, its echo lingering like a phantom. The light had passed, but its imprint remained, repeating itself endlessly, never fading, never forgotten. The echo of the flashbulb lingered. A brief white light etched into the eyes even after the night had swallowed it. And in its fading glow, Christine was left with the same question that had haunted her for years. Could she ever tell her own story before others retold it for her? The papers had written her into legend, into scandal, into symbol, but the woman behind the headlines had scarcely been allowed a voice. And so, weary yet determined, Christine turned to the act of writing, to memoirs that might allow her to reclaim what had been taken. Her hand moved across the page as though scratching at a wall, seeking to carve her truth into a surface that resisted. It was not an easy undertaking. The story had already been written by others so many times, repeated, twisted, made into caricature. Each sentence she tried to write carried with it the burden of contradiction. Would it be believed or dismissed as self-pity, as fabrication, as yet another manipulation? Still she persisted, for what else remained to her? She had little money, fewer friends, and a name that still carried weight enough to attract publishers. If her life was to be consumed, then at least she would offer her own telling, however fractured, however imperfect. The act of remembering was painful. To place words on paper was to relive moments she wished forgotten. The caravan of her childhood, the nights in Soho, the locked doors with Profumo, the laughter in Ward's rooms, the gavel striking in Parliament, the prison gates closing. Each memory returned with sharpness, yet also with haze, for memory itself is uncertain, shifting, colored by guilt, by longing, by regret. Christine's pen hesitated often, the ink blotted by pauses where the past weighed too heavily. Some pages filled swiftly, others remained half-written, abandoned when the burden grew too great. When the memoirs were published, they carried her name boldly on the cover, as though this at last were her voice. And yet once more, the world took them and reframed them. Reviewers dissected her words, journalists quoted her selectively, the public read her not for truth, but for titillation. Her attempt at honesty was consumed like everything else, reduced to fragments, interpreted through the same lens of scandal. The Christine who wrote was not the Christine who was read. She remained captive, even in her own words, to the appetite of others. Still, the effort mattered. For within those pages, however distorted by reception, Christine left traces of herself, glimpses of the woman beyond the symbol. She wrote of her childhood with a tenderness few had expected, of her loneliness with a vulnerability that defied caricature. She revealed not simply the scandal, but the wounds it left, not simply the events, but the feelings they stirred. Those who read carefully could see her humanity flickering there, fragile but persistent, a candle in a storm. She returned to the pen again in later years, revisiting the story as though unable to release it, or perhaps unable to escape it. Each attempt was another layer, another effort to carve her own shape into the hard stone of public memory. Yet the story remained stubborn, returning always to the same points, the same headlines, the same names. Christine's life had been claimed by scandal, and even her own words could not fully take it back. She lived with that frustration, the knowledge that her truth would never stand alone, never be unfiltered, never belong entirely to her. In the quiet of her room, she would sit with her notebooks, the pages scattered, the pen scratching, the lamp casting a small pool of light. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent, but inside she was locked in battle with memory. The scratching of the pen was steady at times, hesitant at others, sometimes breaking off into silence when her hand grew tired, when her spirit faltered. She would stare at the unfinished lines, the half-written sentences, and wonder if they said enough, if they could ever say enough. There was a loneliness to the act, a solitude that pressed upon her as heavily as the silence of prison once had. Writing was both solace and torment. Solace in that it gave her something to hold, torment in that it forced her to relive what she wished to forget. She wrote not to be admired, but to be understood. Yet even she knew that understanding was a fragile hope, one unlikely to be granted. Still, the pages filled slowly, imperfectly, bearing her voice in fragments. She wrote of love and betrayal, of laughter and grief, of the contradictions that had shaped her. She did not offer easy answers, for she had none. Instead, she left questions lingering, as they lingered in her own mind. Was she victim or accomplice, used or willing? Was she remembered for what she had done or for what others had made of her? Did anyone ever truly see her, or had she always been only reflection, image, symbol? The scratching of the pen grew softer one night, the ink running low. Christine set it down, her hand trembling slightly, her eyes heavy with fatigue. She looked at the half-written page before her, the last line trailing off into silence, unfinished. She left it that way, unable or unwilling to continue. Perhaps it was fitting. Her story had never been complete, never fully told, never allowed to reach its end without interruption. The unfinished line was as honest as anything she had written, a reflection of a life always interrupted, always unfinished. She blew gently on the page to dry the ink, then closed the notebook. The room was quiet save for the hum of the city outside, the faint murmur of traffic, the sigh of wind against the glass. Christine leaned back, her eyes half closed, listening to the silence. The pen lay still, the page unfinished, the story unresolved. The scratching had stopped, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the weight of what could not be said, of what could not be reclaimed. The pen remained upon the table, its ink drying, its purpose paused. Christine closed her eyes fully now, and in the darkness the sound of the scratching seemed to linger, faint, as though memory itself were still writing, even when she could not. The pen lay upon the table, its ink drying to silence, and the page before it remained unfinished, the last sentence trailing into emptiness. Christine closed her eyes, yet even in that darkness, the weight of incompletion lingered. The years moved on, as they always do, indifferent to unfinished stories, and Christine herself drifted into later life with the weariness of one who has carried too many burdens for too long. Fame had long since curdled into notoriety, notoriety into obscurity, and obscurity into the quiet shadow of solitude. The world that once could not turn its gaze from her had largely turned away, leaving her to the slow, unlit corridors of old age and illness. She lived not in the bright rooms of Ward's parties, nor in the glittering gardens of Cliveden, but in modest spaces, flats with peeling paint, small comforts, silence. Her health began to falter, her body no longer carrying the sharp lines and radiance that once made cameras pause. She became thin, fragile, marked by the illnesses that crept in quietly, pressing upon her lungs, her bones, her breath. The doctors gave her words for these ailments, tuberculosis, chronic conditions that wore her down, but Christine gave them no grand names, only sighs, only silence. The world remembered her as beauty, yet she felt only the erosion of time. In those later years, she was almost invisible. She could walk streets unrecognized by younger generations who knew her name only as history, who glanced at her without realizing that the frail woman before them had once been the face of a scandal that shook a government. For those who did recognize her, it was sometimes with disbelief, as though the ghost of the past had returned in altered form. They saw not the girl of 19, radiant and dangerous, but an older woman, stooped slightly, her eyes tired. Christine herself sometimes looked in the mirror and struggled to reconcile the reflection with the endless photographs the world had preserved. Which was she? The image immortalized in Scandal, or the woman before her, coughing in the night, forgotten by most? She still carried fragments of her past, for they could never be left behind. She kept old clippings, photographs, books, sometimes tucked away in drawers, sometimes scattered on tables. Visitors who came upon them might think she lingered on her scandal, unable to release it, but in truth she held them as one holds relics of a life both cursed and cherished. They were reminders of her youth, of the time when she was seen, even if it was harshly, even if it was wrongly. To be forgotten entirely would have been another kind of death, and so she held on to the fragments even as they pained her. Her son grew into adulthood, and in him Christine found a fragile strand of continuity, a reason to endure. She was not only Christine the scandal, nor only Christine the symbol. She was also a mother, though that role was often overshadowed in the telling of her life. In quiet moments she spoke with tenderness, with gentleness, her voice stripped of the hardness that years of public scrutiny had forced upon her. These moments of private love were hers alone, unseen by the world, untold by the newspapers, unremembered by history. Yet perhaps they were truer than any headline, more authentic than any photograph. Illness continued its steady encroachment. Hospital visits became more frequent, the sterile smell of antiseptic replacing the perfume of her youth. Nurses who tended to her often did not know who she was, or if they did not speak of it. She was simply another patient, another body to be mended, another woman fading slowly. Christine accepted this anonymity with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the scrutiny had lessened, sorrow that she was remembered only by shadows. At times, journalists still sought her out, their questions familiar, their cameras intrusive. She answered less, gave shorter replies, grew tired more quickly of the repetition. She knew they did not come to see her as she was. They came to see what remained of the Christine Keeler they imagined. the echo of the scandalous girl. She was patient at times, irritable at others, but always aware that she would never fully escape their interest. Even in frailty, even in illness, she remained theirs to consume. And yet, despite the weight of scandal, Christine endured. She lived through poverty, through prison, through judgment, through isolation, and still she remained. She was scarred, weary, ill, but she was not erased. There was a stubbornness in her, a quiet resilience that refused to let her vanish entirely. She may have been abandoned by governments, by friends, by lovers, by the public's fleeting admiration, but she carried herself forward, one day into the next, until the days became years, until the years became decades. She spent long hours by her window in those later years, watching the world move past her. The street outside shifted with the decades, the faces younger, the cars different, the fashions unfamiliar. She sat quietly, her eyes following the movements, her thoughts drifting backward as much as forward. Did she wonder if any of those who passed knew who she was, what she had been? Did she long to be recognized, or did she pray for anonymity? Perhaps she felt both, for her life had always been lived in contradiction, between longing and fear, between desire and regret. The rain often tapped softly against the glass, its rhythm steady, patient, indifferent. Christine listened to it as though it were a lullaby, its persistence both comforting and sorrowful. She thought of all the nights of her youth, when music had filled the air, when laughter had carried her into dawn. Now the music was gone, replaced by the steady tap of rain, by the silence of illness, by the distant hum of the city that no longer looked her way. In those moments by the window, she must have asked herself if she was remembered at all, if her name still lingered beyond the walls of her room. Perhaps she feared that she would be forgotten, her story swallowed by time. Or perhaps she hoped for it, hoping that obscurity might finally bring her peace. The truth, as always in her life, lay in the space between. She was both forgotten and remembered, both absent and present, both invisible and enduring. The rain tapped on, gentle, ceaseless, blurring the world beyond the glass. Christine sat with her hands folded, her breath slow, her eyes distant. The sound filled the room, soft yet insistent, as though carrying a message she could not quite hear. She leaned her head against the glass, the coolness pressing her skin, and closed her eyes. The tapping continued, a rhythm without end, unresolved, carrying her further into the silence of her later years. The rain tapped softly on the glass, each drop tracing its own slow path downward, a rhythm steady and unchanging, as though time itself had taken to whispering against her window. Christine often sat listening, her breath matching the rise and fall of the sound, her thoughts drifting between memory and silence. Illness had tightened its grip upon her by then, leaving her frail, her body thinner, her movement slower, her voice quieter. Days blurred into nights, nights into days. The rhythm of rain, her companion when laughter and music had long since departed. And so the years drew on until the world reached December of 2017, when Christine Keeler passed from it quietly, her life ending not with applause, nor with headlines shouted on every corner, but with a silence so soft it seemed almost unremarked. The woman who had once filled newspapers across continents, whose name had toppled a minister, whose face had haunted the government of a nation, slipped away in relative obscurity. She died in a small hospital room, far from the grand chambers of Parliament, far from the smoky clubs of Soho, far from the perfumed gatherings of Stephen Ward. Tuberculosis, that old disease of shadows, returned to claim her body after years of frailty. Her lungs weakened, her strength gone. She was 75 years old, though those who had only known her image in Scandal might have imagined her forever young, frozen at 19, standing at Cliveden, smiling faintly beneath the summer sun, News of her death appeared, of course, in the papers. But it was different now. The headlines were smaller, the tone more muted, more reflective. The world had changed in the decades since her scandal. New figures had arisen, new stories consumed the public, and Christine's name, once on every tongue, was now remembered only by those old enough to recall, or by those who sought history's darker tales. Obituaries spoke of her life in paragraphs, recounting the affair, the scandal, the prison, the poverty, the attempts at memoir. Some added a note of sympathy, others of condemnation, but all framed her in relation to that same story. Even in death, she was not freed from it. Yet there was a sadness in the way the world received the news. Some remembered her with pity, others with regret, a few with admiration for her endurance. Many remarked on the tragedy of her life, how beauty had brought her not fortune but ruin, how desire and power had entangled her in webs she could never escape. In cafes and living rooms, older voices recalled the headlines of 1963, the photographs, the gossip, the sensation. Younger listeners, hearing her name perhaps for the first time, asked who she was, and the story was told again, half remembered, half understood, a myth more than a life. For Christine herself, there was no myth in those final moments. Only the hospital room, the thin sheets, the hum of machines, the footsteps of nurses. Only the presence of family who remained by her side, her son among them, her hand held gently as her breath grew shallower. In those last hours, perhaps she thought of her youth, of the caravan, of the clubs, of Ward and Profumo, of laughter and betrayal, of the countless flashbulbs, of the silence of prison. Or perhaps she thought of nothing at all, her mind quiet, her heart weary, her spirit ready to release. Death is rarely the grand finale we imagine. More often it is a soft fading, a candle guttering until it gives no more light. When the news reached the public, there were those who barely noticed. A headline here, a broadcast there, a passing mention among the endless churn of modern stories. The world that had once devoured her life now swallowed her death in silence. And perhaps that was fitting, for Christine had longed in her later years, not for recognition, but for peace, not for headlines, but for quiet. Her passing, gentle and subdued, carried a kind of mercy. Still, one cannot help but wonder at the paradox. How strange that a woman who had once symbolized scandal, who had once been described as the most dangerous in Britain, could leave the world with so little disturbance. How strange that the name which had rocked the establishment for a season should vanish with a whisper rather than a shout. Was it justice, or was it tragedy? Was it freedom at last, or was it erasure? These questions linger, unanswered, carried like the rain against her window, steady, unresolved. Her funeral was modest, attended by family, by a few friends who had remained, by those who had loved her beyond the scandal. There were no statesmen, no grandees, no cameras flashing in a frenzy, only the quiet murmur of prayers, the rustle of leaves, the slow lowering of earth. Christine was laid to rest not as symbol but as woman, her name spoken softly by those who knew her, not for headlines, but for the small tendernesses of daily life. And in the days that followed, the rain tapped again, falling upon pavements, upon rooftops, upon glass. Those who passed her grave may not have known the weight of her story, may not have paused to think of the girl who had once stood at the center of history's storm. Yet the silence of her passing carried its own kind of dignity, as though the world had at last allowed her to fade gently, like the rain itself, falling, vanishing, absorbed into the earth. The pages of obituaries closed, the headlines faded, the voices moved on. Yet for those who remembered, for those who still saw her face in the mind's eye, Christine remained, not in the noise of scandal, but in the quiet tragedy of a life consumed by it. Her death was scarcely noticed, yet her story, retold endlessly, ensured that she was never entirely forgotten. She lingered in memory like a whisper, like the final drops of rain upon glass. And as the rain subsided, as the clouds parted briefly to reveal a pale, indifferent sky, the silence that followed seemed to hold her still, unresolved, unfinished. It was the same silence that had haunted her life, the silence of absence, of denial, of erasure. It was the silence she carried with her to the end and beyond. The silence that followed the rain was heavy, not the silence of peace, but of incompletion, of something left unresolved. Christine had passed, her story closed in fact, yet still open in meaning, and the world seemed uncertain of what to do with her memory. She had been cast so often as symbol, as scandal, as seductress, as scapegoat, that in death the question returned with greater force. Who had she truly been? Was she ever known as herself, or only as the figure others required her to be? The silence did not answer. It only echoed the question, leaving it suspended, like a note never resolved at the end of a song. Christine's legacy was a paradox, woven of both tragedy and endurance. She was remembered for the affair that brought down a minister, for the trial that exposed a society's hypocrisies, for the scandal that rocked the establishment. Yet in being remembered so, she was also forgotten, her humanity obscured beneath the weight of myth. She became shorthand, a cautionary tale, invoked not as a person but as example. Politicians spoke of her name when warning of weakness. Historians wrote of her when recounting the fall of Macmillan's government. Journalists returned to her story whenever new scandal emerged. Her image endured, but herself was lost. And yet, for all the distortions, Christine persisted. She lived beyond the scandal, beyond the prison, beyond the headlines, carrying herself through decades of poverty, of illness, of solitude. She endured the gaze of the public, the hunger of the press, the betrayal of lovers, the silence of friends. She endured and she survived, though survival itself was never simple, never free. Perhaps this was her truest legacy, not the scandal that consumed her, but the endurance that carried her beyond it. Few could have borne so much and remained, yet she did, frail yet unbroken, marked yet present, scarred yet still herself in fragments. In reflection, Christine's life revealed much about the world in which she lived. It revealed the fragility of power, how a government could be shaken not by armies or bombs, but by whispers in a bedroom. It revealed the cruelty of judgment, how a young woman could be consumed to shield the reputations of men. It revealed the hunger of the media, how beauty could be exalted and destroyed in the same breath. It revealed the paradox of desire and condemnation, how society could pursue with lust what it then condemned with scorn. Christine became mirror as much as woman, reflecting back the contradictions of her time. But mirrors, once cracked, reveal not clarity but fragments. Christine's story, told and retold, remains fractured. Was she victim or was she reckless? Was she exploited or did she choose her path? Was she dangerous or merely vulnerable? No answer is complete, for her life resists neat conclusion. Perhaps the truth lies not in choosing, but in holding the contradictions together, in accepting that she was all of these things at once. Like the cracked mirror she once gazed into, her story is not one image but many, broken yet still reflecting light. Those who study history may ask whether Christine truly changed the course of events, whether the Profumo Affair was an accident of personal folly or a turning point in public life. Yet for Christine herself, the question was simpler, more human. She asked only whether she had ever been seen as herself, whether anyone had looked beyond the headlines, beyond the scandal, beyond the beauty, to see the girl who had grown up in poverty, who had longed for recognition, who had stumbled into a storm larger than she could bear. In truth, few did. She remained unseen, even as she was watched by millions. At her funeral, the earth fell softly upon the coffin, the sound muted, final. Those who stood by spoke her name quietly, not as headline, not as scandal, but as Christine. In that moment, perhaps, she was seen more clearly than she had been in decades, not as symbol, but as woman, fragile, flawed, human. And perhaps that is where her story truly rests, not in the halls of Parliament, not in the pages of newspapers, but in the quiet recognition that behind every scandal lies a person, a life, a heart that beats and breaks. As the years pass, Christine's name will fade further from memory, remembered only in history books, in old photographs, in the fading recollections of those who lived through 1963. Yet even as it fades, the questions she embodied remain. What do we do with those whom society both desires and condemns? How do we see the person behind the image? How do we tell stories that honor the human rather than devour it? Christine leaves us not answers but questions, lingering like the silence after rain, unresolved yet insistent. The silence deepens. The rain has ceased, the air is still, the world moves on, and in that stillness one may hear, faintly, the memory of Christine herself. A girl once standing at the edge of a pool at Cliveden, the sunlight upon her face, a smile caught between innocence and knowledge, a figure unknowingly poised at the threshold of history. She lingers there, suspended, unresolved, as though forever asking, "Did you ever see me? Or only what you wish to see?" And then the silence returns, heavy, complete, leaving the question unanswered, leaving Christine Keeler as she always was, a woman of fragments, a story of contradictions, a life unresolved.